All right, cool. We're live and back. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm excellent. I'm excellent. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. So we had a little bit of a glitch yesterday, but we're typically on Mondays, as everyone knows, but we're here on Tuesday. We're here on Tuesday, but next week for sure we'll be back at it on Monday. All right, cool. So we're talking about chapter 21 this week, and chapter 21 of Kapital. The title of the chapter is Peace Wages, and we'll get into that stuff in a bit. But before we do, as I typically ask, Señor Mateo Sedillo, how are things in the literary world for you?
Well, I'm sorry. I've just been burying my head so deep into writing this book that I don't really have any real updates other than I just I'm in production.
All right, cool. So busy on a project. Well, it's yeah. We're looking forward to what is in store and literally in the store down the road. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so this particular chapter is interesting for me because I'm very, very familiar with the topic of its focus. And before we get into the details and the substance of this particular topic, I'd like to introduce our discussion this afternoon, Matt, by sharing an observation taken from the real world as it is, and I'd like to begin by doing so the following way. It's not unusual, goes my introduction. It's not unusual to see delivery truck drivers, Federal Express, UPS, Amazon, and other unbranded delivery trucks, right, making their way up and down my neighborhood well after dinner time. I've caught some folks, in fact, into the late hours of the night, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, delivering packages to folks here in my neighborhood. In fact, just Saturday night, I saw a U.S. postal carrier delivering late into the evening. Though I'm not familiar with the details of their work, I consulted some citations that I obtained online and learned, as I expected, right, that delivery persons are among the ranks of those who are paid on the basis of units produced or actions performed. We call this piece rate. Marx called it piece wages. The practice is one with which I have great familiarity on account of the construction work I did with my father as his son and as his employee. On account of life stories, I'm familiar with piece wages or piece rate work, right? Also on account of life stories my Chicano college roommates shared with me as child agricultural workers, and also on account of watching the 1983 movie El Norte. I've also learned about piece rate work by way of conversations with my students, many of whom are the children of garment working parents, and the things that I've read about garment workers in the LA area. In fact, I've even learned about piece wages or piece rate on account of immediate experiences as a junior high school teacher in the 1990s. Odd, that I would cite that experience as a point of reference for learning, because the fact is, in LAUSD, we were told, right, that plans, this is in the mid to late 90s, we were informed that there were plans to fund our schools on the basis of English fluent units. I mean, students we produced. So it's on the basis that it's on this basis that chapter 21 has special significance for me. It gives me opportunity to understand the abstractions of what we know as piecework and what, again, Marx calls piece wages. Before we get into the language of the book, Matt, would you like to respond?
No, I do have had a job working for family, so I have an understanding of. Well, please continue. Please continue.
All right. Well, before we get into the actual language of chapter 21, and it's a rather short chapter, as a matter of fact. It must be about 6 or 7 pages. I'd like to discuss a report called "Undocumented Workers in the U.S. Garment Sector." It's from a think tank, I suppose, a news outlet, an information outlet called Verite, and it's a report that was published in 2014 concerning garment workers. And this particular report, and also some information that I also gathered from the UCLA Labor Center concerning garment work, right, sheds light on the importance and the significance of Mexican origin people, the parents and grandparents and relatives of Chicana and Chicano young people in the LA metropolitan region, and particularly those in the central areas of the LA metropolitan region. Of course, I mean, the areas all along the 710 freeway, all along the 110 freeway, and of course north of the 405 and south of the 10 freeway. I'm talking about this general region at this point. Anyway, drawing from each of these reports, I'd like to share a couple things. First off, today garment manufacturing is concentrated, it says here, in California and New York. Until the 1960s, New York served as the national hub for U.S. garment production, accounting for 95% of clothing purchased by the U.S. domestic market, right? Research conducted in New York in 2002 identified 1,600 garment manufacturers and 2,600 contractors registered with the New York Department of Labor, with an additional 2,500 unregistered work sites. Today, however, LA has overtaken New York in terms of production output, with 8 billion in 2012. Again, this is a 2014 report. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were almost 3,000 registered apparel factories in the LA area in 2010, and over 1,000 in New York. Texas, by the way, is also identified here, and of course, you and I know that Texas is also a major has a major concentration of Mexican origin people. Texas is the 3rd largest manufacturer with the significantly lower total of 274 manufacturers. I'd like to underscore the significance of this information, particularly as far as Chicana and Chicano people are concerned. As I understand, the large proportion of garment workers, at least people on the sewing machines, the operators as they're called, are women, but certainly men constitute, a proportion of garment workers as well. And as we're learning, right, of the top three locations where our clothes is manufactured, right? Two are important destination points for Mexican immigrant people, right? California and Southern California in particular, the city of LA. City of LA is only surpassed by Mexico City itself with the proportion of Mexican people. So we're talking about um, issues of Chicana and Chicano labor, right, that are not just significant in and of themselves, but significant for the nation, right? Significant for the nation. In the UCLA report, Hanging by a Thread, this is a report that was published in 2015, it informs, right, that many of the industrial jobs in the greater LA region are in the garment sector, which accounts for more than 45,000 of the area's 50,000. I'm sorry, of the area's 500,000 manufacturing positions. So clothing manufacturing, we learn here, right, is the greatest industrial sector, right, and the greatest industrial sector of the LA of the remaining industries in the LA metropolitan region. And as we know, right, it is Chicana and Chicano people that constitute the bulwark, if you will, or the largest proportion of operators in the industry's sewing machines. And we'll talk about homework and so forth in just a little bit. But in any case, in the region's downtown fashion district, a vast network, says this is according to the UCLA report, in the region's downtown fashion district, a vast network of garment factories and sweatshops anchor the fast fashion production end of a global supply chain in which massive quantities of overseas fabrics are assembled by recently arrived Latino and Latina and Asian immigrant workers. And of course, the report identifies notable fashion labels like Forever 21, Charlotte Russe, Papaya, and Wet Seal, right? These are just some of the few brands that garment workers are producing and sewing today. What do you think about that, Matt?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to talk about like California overcoming New York, California over Los Angeles overcoming New York City. Because when we really think about New York City, I mean, like, well, who would be doing that labor there? You know, it's not. This is not like, you know, multi-generational, you know, Irish American, American labor. This is probably over there also likely labor coming from Latin America,
Asia,
of
course,
Asia, as well. So and you know, prior to that, I mean, you know, if you think about earlier time periods in the history of New York, I mean, like think about garment district, garment industry, you think about like a Triangle Factory fire, right? So this is like, that would be like recently immigrated, you know, mostly Jewish labor, but you know, but coming from like Eastern Europe. So that's coming at a time period where that was a wave of immigration. You know, so the garment industry is tied to one way or another. And then it was, you know, the Triangle Fire Factory. Those were all women. So the garment industry has always been tied to vulnerable labor. It's been tied to labor that cannot defend itself in the ways that other demographics. They target demographics that are more or less organized and have more difficulty organizing. You know, in the process of making this. I mean, obviously, you know, America's, you know, born of that. America's born of, you know, economically anyways, America's born of slavery. I mean, of you know, forced labor, and your lives, to feed what? To feed specifically to feed the garment industry. I mean, really, cotton. So I mean, this is at the root of U.S. history and of the development of capital. and it continues to this day, as we see in sweatshops right here in the United States, not just around the world, but right here in the United States.
Yeah.
And it is, it is the people who are most vulnerable that are doing that labor. Yeah. They're doing that work.
The logic and the logic of literally capitalizing on the vulnerability of people who are seen to be and treated to be, and unfortunately sometimes see themselves to be immigrants, right, is a logic and a practice that goes back to the origins even of this particular industry. And we'll talk about that once we get into the details of chapter 21, because here, as a matter of fact, Marx addresses the garment industry, of all things, in London in the middle of the 19th century. Anyway, going back to the Verite report, garment factories in New York and LA typically contract between 5 and 50 workers, principally female immigrants. And many factories, right, employ fewer than 20 workers. Factory size is often intentional, and this is what gets at this question of vulnerability that we were just addressing a few moments ago. Factory size is often intentionally limited to a small workforce that can be laid off more easily during slow periods. I'm reminded of the conversation that we had last week about time wages as opposed to piece wages. But in any case, continuing with the theme of chapter 21, piece wages, this report, the Verite report, states, many small factories close due to an inability to turn a profit. When this occurs, informal contractors can easily shut down and reopen shops in other locations under different names to avoid legal liability or payment of employee-backed wages. Consequently, the average life of a garment sewing shop is 13 months. In addition, the relatively short training period for workers allows sewing contractors the ability to hire personnel easily, as entry-level sewers can reach the standard rate for sewing in a matter of months. Garment workers contend not only with employers motivated to pay low wages, but also with competing laborers who could easily replace them. So the experience of garment workers, and again, this is principally female immigrants or immigrant workers in the LA metropolitan region, and of course New York, and then following a distant third is Texas, right? These are the conditions.
Which cities in Texas?
One more time.
Did it say which cities in Texas, or just the whole city of Texas?
The report, as I read the report last night or the night before, I didn't get to the particular cities, but I wouldn't be surprised if the manufacturing centers were in places like Houston, central hubs, central quote unquote exporting hubs for both the national and international market. So Houston ought to be. It'd be interesting too. Why do you ask that question?
Well, I'm curious if it's in the Rio Grande Valley, near the Mexican border, or if it's in like Houston or Dallas, which are major, which are the two real kind of major cities in. I mean, Houston, Dallas, Austin's one of those cities that's not as big as everyone thinks it is. It's actually much smaller than people think it is. It's got an outsized reputation, kind of like Boston or San Francisco. This is actually not as many people think that people might think it is actually living in those cities. But yeah, Dallas and Houston are probably the two biggest.
Yeah.
Well, but
go ahead.
No, I think it's Dallas, Houston, maybe I think the third one is San Antonio actually. But so I'd be curious to see if it's in the cities that are just more proportionate, have a higher proportion of Mexican people, and undocumented, or if it's just the major hubs. I think Dallas is something like 30%. Latino, and it's about 30% black and about 30% white. some variants, some of that. And then Houston is like 40%, I think, and more, than roughly the same population. So I'm just curious. I'm just curious. Is it Dallas or Houston, or is it just the Rio Grande Valley where it's like 95%?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know if I'll share the information in what I'm about, and I don't know if I have the information quoted here in my notes, but certainly one of the things that I learned in preparation for the discussion that we're having around Chapter 21 is that the largest proportion of contractors with the clothing brands, the largest proportion of these contractors are Asian immigrants. And at the moment, if we're contemplating the role of Houston in this particular industry in the state of Texas, Houston is currently experiencing a boom in the growth of immigrants from Asian countries and regions. So it'd be interesting. Maybe somebody that's listening to us, and maybe folks out there in the Texas area can give us some clues as to what the situation is as far as this industry. The thing is that if we're talking about this industry, and given the fact that it's you and I who are reading Kapital, you and I, Matt, who are interested in Kapital for understanding the historical and economic circumstances of Mexican origin people, of Chicana and Chicano people, right? It's right that we be focusing on the experiences, right, of people in this particular industry. It leads me to address something that is popping up at the moment, kind of cutting edge stuff in the area of Chicana and Chicano studies, in the sense that where at the outset of the discipline, as Chicanos and Chicanas came to understand themselves and see themselves as a racial minority, as an exploited, as a racial minority constituted by large proportions of working class people exploited in a racist society by white capitalism. This kind of information that we're learning about as far as garment workers in the contemporary context gives us an opportunity to see that that race relations are not those same race relations that saw the rise of the discipline in the late 60s, early 70s. I'm talking about Chicano studies in particular, right? So that race relations today, impacted by the presence of the transnational global capitalist class from other parts of the planet, right? In this case, we're talking about capitalist entrepreneurs from Asia locating themselves in areas that have been traditionally inhabited by Chicana and Chicano people, complicates a simple discussion of race relations, perhaps, or rather a decades-long discussion of race relations as far as Chicana and Chicano people are concerned. Perhaps, right, folks might want to contribute to the discussion as far as this goes in the comments section. It'd be interesting to see what folks are contemplating in this regard.
Well, I think when we couch in the question of race relations, that's when people get very sensitive and very picky and very like, are you saying that I'm blah 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 blah? Are you saying that this? And they take it very personal because it's all wrapped up in identity.
Yeah.
So when you ask this particular question about the infusion of like Asian capital, infusion of capital from China and from Korea, particularly those two countries, coming into portions of the country that have been typically inhabited by people of Mexican descent or Mexicans, increasingly people from Central America, like let's say the San Gabriel Valley, probably the biggest, most obvious, right? people get really prickly about that because they're saying like, "Oh, are you saying that like, well, we're like white people? Are you saying this? Are you saying this and that?" But when you really focus on the fact that we're talking about capital investment, we're talking about money, we're talking about whatever, we're talking about real estate, we're talking about the sale of real estate, we're talking about the sale of, we're talking about the change of neighborhoods, we're talking about we're talking about who was owning and who was working, right? Then these questions, they clear up pretty quick. I mean, they become very they become really clear as to what we're talking about, and for sure, within the past past few decades, there's been a lot of investment. I mean, I remember growing up in El Sereno, I remember everyone was talking about Monterey Park and everyone was talking about Alhambra,
Yeah.
and how these cities were changing into becoming more Asian neighborhoods. But Monterey Park and Alhambra, those neighborhoods are typically more working class, no matter what, like regardless of Asian
Hmm.
or Chicano people in there. They're for the most part pretty working class. It's not until you start getting like San Marino and other places like that that you start that
Yeah.
class distinction, or at least people that own the stuff, people that own
Yeah. Yeah.
things.
That's where the owners
That's the
live.
owners. People that own the
Yeah.
stuff in Alhambra and Monterey Park. Funny enough, actually, my sister's godfather, they're the godparent, her godfather. I don't know what her godmother is. My sister's godfather actually lives in San Marino, and he's Mexican.
Really?
And but he owns he owns uh La Reina
Oh
Tortillas,
yeah.
right? His family owns La Reina
Yeah.
in Chile. So yeah, so the owners live the owners of the general area. They live in San Marino, regardless, right? But he's an anomaly there, right? That neighborhood, if you look at the demographics, I think it's something like 40. Last I looked, it was like 45% Asian, some like
Hmm.
40 something percent white, and then everybody else, I guess, makes up the margins. But yeah, it is definitely within the San Gabriel Valley a growing number of very wealthy Asians in the LA area, and they live mostly in the San Gabriel Valley, and they own things mostly around the San Gabriel Valley, different parts of it. And I mean, I don't really know source of income, but but it is true they mostly live in the San Gabriel Valley, this new pocket of wealth that is arriving. They don't typically live in these more exclusive white enclaves that like Hidden Hills or Bel Air or other places like that. Um, they don't typically live there, and I'm getting someone says, "Where are you getting all this information? What are you just making this up?" No, you can actually go to Mapping Los Angeles. You can go to something called Mapping LA, and you can actually check out the demographics. The LA Times put it out years ago, and it's called Mapping LA. And I don't know how often they update it, but you can click on demographics, you can click on income levels, and it'll show you the demographics of different neighborhoods. And the wealthiest of wealthy neighborhoods, the top like five wealthy neighborhoods in Los Angeles, are mostly white. But we're talking about populations of like 5, 10,000, right?
Hmm.
And in this case, San Marino, you're talking about a case with maybe 11,000 or something like that. But San Marino is actually the wealthiest neighborhood that is kind of like white and Asian, and then it goes from down there. So at the wealthiest neighborhoods in LA. This is very interesting to look at. The wealthiest neighborhoods in Los Angeles are almost all white, and they're like 90 some odd percent white. Then it goes down a notch, and then you see like the more working class, and they're not working class. Then you go down a notch, you see not quite that level of elite wealth, and then it says it gets very white and Asian. Then after that, you get more working class and becomes very Asian Latino, right? And this was where this group of people come in. Then after that, you go below that, and then it becomes almost exclusively Latino. Then you get a little lower than that, it becomes Black and Latino. At the very bottom, it's like the very bottom, it's like Black and Latino, like
Yeah.
Watson, neighborhoods like that.
Yeah.
But one of the poorest neighborhoods of all, right, is Chinatown. So, and then which is almost very exclusively Asian. So that neighborhood, I think neighborhoods is like third poorest. I mean, I think there's only the only areas that are poor are University Park, which is artificially poor because it's students, right, over by USC. So they're not really poor. They have low income because they don't have to have an income. Officially poor, and then downtown Los Angeles itself, where people homeless, right? So then, but just above that is Chinatown, and Chinatown's actually, at least at the time, LA Times put this list together, Chinatown's actually poorer than Watts. So you do have this like huge class stratification between Asian capital that's coming in, and people are moving in and thriving within the economy, living in a place like San Marino, and then people living in Chinatown who are more the exploited workers. So those are garment workers coming from China. Those are sweatshop workers, people living there. So incredible class stratification when it comes to Asians living in America. And on the one hand you have this rising kind of kind of Asian American bourgeoisie, and on the other hand you have like this proletariat that is just as desperate as people that we think of when we think of migrant labor, right. Mexicans and Central Americans. So yeah. It's definitely it's definitely something to watch. But again, when you couch that in like racial relations, right, then it becomes like you're Asian and you guys you have privilege in this country, and you're looked at as a model minority, and people see you and they have positive associations. People see me and they think I'm going to rob the store, and therefore I hate you, and I don't want to hear about your problems. That's when people get really sensitive and people get really upset, and people, you're denying my life, and you don't know, like, I got teased in school and I got bullied, and so like, and all those things are true. They're not saying anything that's not true. So Asians do face tremendous amounts of disrespect and racism in this country. They are underrepresented in media. You grow up in a place where you don't think you exist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they, rich or poor, they feel that, right? So that's true. It's also true, though, that like what you're describing is that this influx of Asian capital comes into the United States of America, and it ends up, oftentimes they end up with the exploitation of Mexican workers, like in restaurants and this and in a number of fields, a number of industries, right? So that's also true. Both those things are true, and one does not negate the other. And so when we talk about things that way, maybe we can have a more healthy conversation. But I know that this conversation about Asian capital and Mexican labor, Chinese capital, Korean capital, and Mexican labor, Salvadoran labor, whatever, I know it's like really sensitive, and people get really like uneasy about it because when we couch it in this kind of like metaphysical language of like people's feelings and stuff like that, that's going to happen. But when we couch it in like in real material kind of facts about this much money, this much labor, these workers, this place, this pocket of land, then I think it puts us in a better position to have an honest conversation.
Yeah, and that's a problem with identity politics and identity-based understandings of things, because of course they don't. Those discussions are so closely tied to the sentiments and individual experiences of certain people that they exclude tangible, objective, quantifiable understandings of the patterns in.
Well, you gotta understand, like when you're telling someone though, like when you couch it in concept of race relations, like let's say somebody's like wealthy from San Marino or from whatever, right, and they have like this experience in life, right, or they have this position in economy, and the position in the world, and they have kind of a certain idea, right, and their family owns something, and they own something, and they're part of the ownership of something, right. And then you couch it in race relations, it's almost like you're telling them, well, you've never really experienced racism, right? And this person could have grown up their entire life, and been in situations where they've seen like their parents disrespected, they themselves have been disrespected. That's what I mean. So you can understand like why this is not a really good entry point. Like this is not like a good way to like actually begin this conversation, as opposed to just looking at the material facts on the ground, this, that, the other. And then you get a more just again, a more detailed and more honest conversation, as opposed to one that's based in just like how people feel about themselves, how you feel about them, and that gets ridiculous, right? And then they're gonna give me examples of times where someone said something to them like, well, you're saying this, but one time this guy said this thing to me, and it's just
they're conversations that don't transcend immediate opinions and individual experiences or anecdotal experiences at best, certainly. So this discussion, this observation, a materialist, a historical materialist understanding then of the experiences of Chicana and Chicano workers, right, gives us an opportunity to transcend these things. You know, I'm reminded of conversations that I have with students when they go there. You know, when they reduce their understandings of the world to wherever it is that they are positioned and the perspectives that they have and that they've cultivated or that have been cultivated for them wherever it is that they happen to find themselves. And you know, oftentimes students will say, you know, I feel this, that, and the other. I feel this and I feel that, and I see them. Well, if we reduce our understandings to our feelings based on where it is we stand, and even what it is we see, where it is we stand, we might say that the sun rises on the east and sets on the west, right? Because certainly, wherever it is that we stand, if we, you know, turn to the east in the morning, we'll see the sun rising, and wherever it is that we are, we turn to the west in the afternoon or in the evening, and we'll see that the sun is descending on the west, and we'll come to believe that these things are as we see them. And so we are committed to what we see or what we think we see and how we feel about these things. I think race relations is much like this as well, at least but
Right.
not simplistic, limited.
Right.
Of race.
Right, and I think this comes out of academia, where more and more there's increased premium placed on anecdotal evidence, but they can't say that we're gonna move towards anecdotal evidence to make our argument. So instead, they you know, it's very interesting. Like, you know, Karl Rove shares these tactics where it's like, you know, call it the death tax instead of inheritance tax. Call it this, call it that, right? So in defense of you know, using anecdotal evidence and not having to do any research and not having to do any really difficult things, not having to interview people, not having to do quantitative or qualitative research, I'm going to call it lived experience. Instead of calling it anecdotal evidence, I'll call it lived experience. And so you get over and over and over again the drumbeat of lived experience, lived experience, lived experience, lived experience as the basis of analysis. Now I'm a poet, so I have no qualms about, you know, using your lived experience to bolster your argument, but your argument must be more than your lived experience. You know, your lived experience could, like, you know, could pepper, could inform, could give a nice little, you know, could cut right through, could give a nice little, add something to this thing that you research, this presentation that speaks for the life of millions and has evidence that it's speaking for the lives of millions. And then you say, and then your own story gets kind of couched within that. You know, like I'm a big fan of that. But the idea that you're going to present based on only your lived experience, and your lived experience somehow is like is whatever. I mean, of course, you know, your lived experience, you are the leading expert on your life, if you are honest with yourself, right? Which is a very rare quality as well. But you know, that's not like detailed analysis. That's not bringing forth something new and great. And even to say that now, to say that, you know, lived experience is just kind of like, you know, what you're really saying is anecdotal evidence. It is to go against the grain and to invite people to invite you know, repudiation. You know, like, how dare you say that? But like, you know, I don't know, these kind of how dare you politics are also not materialist analysis. I mean, the only materialist analysis is materialist analysis. I think that we need to really invest more in material analysis to understand these questions that get prickly and get sensitive, but only because you're competing, only because you're operating in a world of competing anecdotal evidence, only because you're operating in a world of competing lived experiences. Does everything become so entangled and unable to move forward, because you're saying, like, well, I feel this way, well, I felt this way, well, let me tell you something, let me tell you what happened to my mom. Oh, I have your mom, well, let me tell you what happened to me. You know, you know, it just goes on and on and on.
Our task is then to identify the general patterns, and I think that that's what the brilliance for me, as far as this book itself is concerned, is in Marx's attention to general patterns and general flows of capital, and the ways in which these flows throughout time and in space have borne on people, right? such that one set of chains in this flow of chains that is transpiring across time and space, right, is useful to understand the particular links, right? And if we reduce ourselves to understanding this chain or this flow, if we reduce our understanding of the world to these particular links, right, across or between the different chain, or between the different links across the chain, we won't have an understanding of the whole trajectory, of the whole movement, of the whole process of capitalism and of history, and of capitalism in history, over the centuries. And that requires transcending anecdotal evidence, that requires transcending individual experiences. And having talked about this, I have here, as a matter of fact, carved out for our discussion a case study, but not a case study that serves not a case study that serves as the
it's different when we do it.
Yeah, just to provide some illustrative context to the themes that to the numbers that we've spent the first half of our discussion addressing. And this is a particular case study, right, of a woman named Margarita, a worker in New York, a Long Island garment worker. She's interviewed by Verite. She happens to be a Central American woman who had worked at a garment factory in Long Island. When Verite spoke with her, she had recently left her position. Margarita found a job in a factory through a man who claimed to be a supervisor. However, in reality, he was another low-level employee who had positioned himself as an ad hoc labor broker because he speaks both English and Spanish. And this particular information, of course, gets at a much larger pattern addressed in chapter 21, as far as Marx's attention to the ways in which labor exploits labor. If we have time to get into the details of the chapter, of course, we'll address this. This particular supervisor, this particular quote-unquote contractor, right, initially demanded $20 per week as compensation for finding her the job, but later raised the amount to $40. She learned he was giving kickbacks to a manager under the table. They continued to collect money from workers no longer employed at the factory until a factory owner discovered this scheme and fired them. Margarita described her workplace as a tightly controlled environment. Employees worked for 12 to 16 hours per day, 5 to 6 days per week. It sounds like 19th century London here. Although they were paid, with the exception, of course, right, that I suppose workers in London were working 7 days a week. Anyway, although they were paid on an hourly basis, time wages, right? Although they were paid on an hourly basis, they were reprimanded for not reaching daily garment quotas, which had to be filled even if an employee was sick or injured. Employees were only allowed 3 minutes to use the restroom, and they were watched in the hallways. If she refused to work overtime, she said the supervisor would deny her opportunities to work overtime in the future. This reminds me of a discussion that we had not too long ago about workers in the chicken and in the meat and poultry processing plants, right? Where again, workers, largely in this case of Mexican extraction, right, were literally forced to wear, adults literally forced to wear diapers at the conveyor belt, right? So it makes me think about the restrictions. This is going to sound strange, but it's true. The restrictions that are imposed upon the children of these workers, right, such that they have to raise their hand to pee when they are in school. Talking about then the correspondence between the socialization that takes place in youth and its correspondence again to their labor as adults. Neither the children nor their parents can pee when their body requires it. Anyway, her supervisors were all white, and the worst treatment was reserved for Latinos and African Americans. Workers could be fired if they complained or were found to lack legal immigration status. You know, at this point, I'm reminded of Marx's analysis of French immigrant workers in the garment industry of London in the 19th century. I mean, this is akin to the experiences of immigrants in England in the 19th century. Workers could be fired if they complained or were found to lack legal immigration status. In addition to long hours, the factor that made her employment most intolerable was the high degree of sexual harassment she experienced. If women gave supervisors sexual favors, they could be promoted. If not, their hours could be cut or they could be fired. Her manager pressured her to sleep with him. She attempted to submit a formal complaint, but none of the office employees spoke Spanish. The relative of another manager harassed her as well, sending her obscene text messages and explicit pictures. He even threatened to kill her over the phone, at which point she called the police. The factory finally registered a formal complaint, but they translated her statement very poorly, clearly misunderstanding the dynamics at play due to language barriers. Margarita concluded by saying, "How could I advance myself if I had to work 12 to 16 hours a day? I had no time to study." She finishes this interview by saying, "You become a slave to your work." Matt, your thoughts?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that's the case of that's you know. I think that oftentimes we look at these things and the tragedy is in the details. The tragedy is in the quantifiable, right? We see that people's lives are quantifiably worse than others, right? We talk about the labor force, but the conditions she's describing are the conditions of labor. Those are the conditions of labor.
Yeah.
I don't care where you work. Those are the conditions of labor that you are subject to command, right? You are subject to being commanded. Now, the conditions of her life, the standard of living that she experiences is significantly lower than most people working in the United States of America. What do I mean by that? I mean the amount that she's being paid, the amount that what she can expect from life, the things she can afford because of those wages, and how little she's being paid for how many hours she ends up working, right? So that makes her life quantifiably worse than most American workers, right? But the quality of her life, the what was qualifiable about her life, the nature of her relationship to her employer is shared by anybody working. I mean, the fact that like you are subject to rule, and you are subject to the rules we make. Now we may make your working conditions easier. You may have negotiated this thing or that or the other, but like the fact of the matter is, like no matter what what is said on the books, an employer is going to do what an employer is going to do, and unless you have the wherewithal to sue or evidence to expose them or whatever, they're simply going to do what they do. I mean, workplace abuses go on all over the place. And what is a workplace abuse? Workplace abuse is is them breaking their own rules. Is a company breaking its own rules, or a company breaking the law of the land, right? But I mean, like the nature of worker owner is abusive inherently. It's inherently abusive. It's inherently exploitive. If it weren't exploitive, it wouldn't exist. I mean, because that we live in a society based on exploitation. I mean, like, and that's not like I'm not using that as like an adjective. I'm not using that as like to indicate it's so bad that it's exploitive. No, it could be good. It could be heaven, but it's still exploitative. Yeah. I mean, because that is what capitalism is. You are getting paid less than you produce. That's exploit. It's technical. It's a technical term. You are being paid less than you produce. You're being exploited. Period. So we have a comment actually in the comment section here from Karina. She says, even non-exempt staff at law firms right now are expected to work 60+ hours a week without claiming overtime. If you say you need overtime, you'll be seen as having productivity issues and face consequences of of the same. So, what I'm saying, like it's everywhere. This idea that if you don't produce producer, producer fail, sink or swim.
Well, as we near the end of the hour of our discussion, we may go about 5 minutes over to make it a complete 60 minutes, Matt. But I'd like to draw attention to particular language of this particular chapter, chapter 21. Marx writes concerning peace, what he calls peace wages and what we call peace rate. He says, peace wages therefore lay the foundation of the modern domestic labor, as well as of a hierarchically organized system of exploitation and oppression. So this is at the abstract level, right? A discussion of the kind of things that we've just spent the last 5-10 minutes addressing. In terms of this hierarchical system, Marx writes, it facilitates the interposition of parasites between capitalist and the wage laborer, the subletting of labor, i.e. the contractor, right? So it gives rise to the presence and the mediation of the kind of folks that inserted themselves in Margarita's, in this particular case, inserted themselves in her employment in ways that a relationship between the capitalist and the worker exclusively would not facilitate. It would not occasion these kinds of relationships. I'm reminded of the ways in which effectively workers, right, trying to scramble their way up the ladder or scramble their way out of the buckets in which they find themselves, have no other choice but to step upon or to hold upon or to pull down as they move their way up the ladder, right, are forced then to exploit and oppress those around them on account of the fact, right, that they did not construct the ladder, that they did not put themselves in the bucket. The bucket existed before them, and then they're forced to live and work and make sense of their lives within these particular buckets, or at the bottom end of these social ladders, effectively having to then step upon and pull upon those around them as they work to, quote unquote, get out of this system, get out of the neighborhood, get out of this employment, make their way into the, quote unquote, middle class.
Yeah, well, I knew someone in New York. I mean, without getting into all these like personal details, but I knew personal details. I knew someone in New York without getting into. I said, without getting into anecdotal evidence, like I was saying. But I knew someone in New York who was from Pueblo, Mexico, and I met them at the Left Forum, and I remember her telling me that she was working with she was I don't know, she was I don't know what they were. She was friendly with this guy and he was like one of the people that brought me out. And so she was talking to us when we were walking there one time. She was telling me the story about how she worked at this not a florist, but somebody that sells plants, like a lot like big plants, and it was mostly Mexican labor there. And then the guy had brought her in as a manager, I guess, because he knew that would like disrupt his workers or whatever, because they were all very sexist and how terrible. I mean, that's terrible, but it really bothered them, and so they were really upset about that. And then that she was their manager, but then he also started hiring in he brought in like someone to like supervise her, right? It was like his nephew or cousin or something like that. It was some white guy, and then they united with her because they were so mad about this other guy being brought in who didn't know the job at all, telling them what to do, right? So. And so they all united with her against this guy. Now, if they weren't, acting that way in the first place, right? If they weren't being, it was very much like a reenactment of the movie The Salt of the Earth, right? If they hadn't had those like macho attitudes about her, then they maybe would have been in a better position to organize against this, or to organize or to negotiate a better conditions against their employer. But then again, maybe but she was kind of young. So I mean, like, now that I'm really looking back, I mean, initially when I heard it, I'm like, wow, this guy's really sexist, and like, wow, like, well, it's good they united, um, over this kind of like feelings of racial solidarity or something, against or cultural whatever against this like white oppressor and his nephew. But now looking back on the story, I mean, it just sounds like this guy would really just bring people in that were like maybe unqualified to be managed. And she wasn't. I mean, because I'm not sure how old she was. Because I mean, you talk about these guys probably in their 30s, and she was like probably like early 20s. I don't know, maybe she I don't know. Maybe she was a really good manager. I don't know. Maybe his nephew actually knew what he was doing. I don't know. I highly doubt it though. I mean, so it really seemed like this boss would really use this plan of bringing in people to manage, and then this person get managed and that person get managed. And this is what corporations do. This is how the managerial the petty bourgeois operates, and how the bourgeois operates. They divide people, they bring people in to manage others, and then they get all upset, and and they lose sight of who's really in charge here, who's really like who's really screwing them over, who's really exploiting all of them. And that's kind of like a microcosm for what actually happens in the world, and people um, you know but if we didn't have these latent prejudices, if we weren't so sexist, if we weren't so racist, if we weren't so if we weren't if the labor force didn't have these just I don't know. I guess the term right now is implicit biases to kind of cover everything, right? If they didn't have those prejudices in their art that initially made them see human being, as unworthy of authority or something, then we can focus more on what's actually happening, and we will be able to organize and able to fight and able to, but that's an uphill battle. I mean, because people cling on to those things because it gives their life definition, it gives their being definition. So they I don't know. I don't know if everyone goes.
Well, we're at the end, and we've been talking about. We've given minimal attention actually to the discussion of piece wages as far as Marx lays it out. Really, what he does, of course, is in this particular chapter, he exposes the ways in which piece wages, as he calls them, are just, is just a distraction, really, to keep workers from understanding how it is that, number one, they're still getting paid on the basis of time, and certainly still getting exploited given the greater capacity to extract surplus labor from labor or from workers under the guise of piece wages, right? And so that's what this particular chapter is about. And it's
right. This chapter he mentions like if a workday is 12 hours, he's only being paid for 6 hours, and he gives it kind of a few calculations. In reality, chapter 20, chapter 21 should be kind of read in conjunction because they're basically like they're basically the flip side of each other's coin. I mean, there's like they're very similar chapters, and there's kind of like I see why he separated them, but it's like one's about time. Like this is how they trick you with time. Here's how they trick you with wages,
yeah.
right? But in the other one, your wages are really time, and this one, your time are really wages. So like it's kind of like it's the inverse of the last one. So it's the inverse of the previous chapter. It's just showing you how, at the end of the day,
it's the same logic. Or rather, fundamentally, it's the same logic.
Right.
Absolutely. Matt, some poetic closure.
Well, I will be remiss to not acknowledge what's going on right now. So in the larger world. So here we go. This poem's called "If 2020 Was an Election." In case you hadn't noticed, the air is toxic, the water is poison, the elections are rack, an empty bucket hurled towards a burning house we call politics, with billions on the line behind closed doors, lobbyists, politicians, disembodied corporations stage a debate on the House floor as though their settled vote had not been cast centuries before. This is some Plymouth shit. Some Dixieland, some wild, wild west. America twists again like it did last Cold War. American intelligence will preemptively blame Chinese or Russian interference for the results of an election when half the population will not vote. Decided by an electoral college, meaning the votes will not count. The American media will blame unarmed black men for being shot by police unions. Police unions will blame anyone with a cell phone for recording the incident. American governors will blame brown workers for a global pandemic. The American public will blame the rest of the globe for being bombed by America. If 2020 were an election, it would start Joe Biden challenging the incumbent Donald Trump. Some red states, some blue states, the U.S. Senate, and New York real estate, kids in cages, knees on necks, a border wall, a border fence, a bipartisan shot in the legs, a segregationist, a Dixiecrat, a dance with two devils as the country burned to the ground, in case you hadn't fucking noticed.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's not hyperbole. The forest was ablaze this summer, and as we are informed by environmental scientists, the forests of the planet will burn at increasing rates. Our world is incinerating itself, and the motor behind this is a political and economic system that depends on sucking the life out of human beings and the environment.
So yeah, I just want to say something. Let's quick before we go. I mean, you just got to think about this. We are drilling in the ocean for oil, and we've been doing that for a very long time. That's insane. We have no idea. We have no idea what the effects of that will be. I mean, we know that it causes oil spill now and again, but we have no idea what the long-term effects of that kind of activity will reap. We
do know right is related to earthquakes, to seismic activity.
Right.
So we're pulling. We're consuming the air, consuming the ground, and we're consuming underneath the ground. We're pulling the rug out from underneath of ourselves as we are suffocating ourselves.
We are constantly throwing toxins into the air, and we're just doing this all the time because we don't know what else to do. Now, we as workers, we as people who don't make the decisions, we're just following orders or whatever. I mean, that's okay. I mean, whatever. But like, I'm not suggesting that, and therefore you need to stop driving your car and buy an electric car. No, I mean, therefore we need to change the system. Therefore we need to fight the system. Therefore we need to change all this, because I mean, this is what we're doing every single day. Every single day we're throwing toxins into the air. Every single day we're throwing toxins in the air. Every single day we're drilling in the ocean. Every single day we are hastening the environmental collapse of the planet. And you can say you had nothing to do with it. You can say you were just going along for the ride. You can say you were being dragged along into it. But yeah, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to fix it. It's not your individual person. It's not your individual fault as just a regular, everyday working person. That's not your fault. These things are happening. You didn't set this in motion. I'm not saying that you need to be more conscientious of what you do. I'm saying that we need to fight these corporations that are doing this to the world. I mean, we need to do that immediately, because the future generations that will not be born do not care that it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything.
Yes. All right, man. We'll talk.
On that note.
Well, it's a good way to end.
All right.
It's a good way to end. All right. Thanks a lot.
See you Monday.